searching for another man, referred to in psychology as extradyadic relationships, whether taking the form of a silent emotional affair or an explicit physical relationship, does not arise in a psychological vacuum, nor can it be understood in isolation from a woman's internal and external context. From a scientific perspective, this behavior is rarely an impulsive, momentary decision or a fleeting emotional whim. Rather, it represents the culmination of a long, unresolved psychological process unfolding within the primary relationship. Emotional and social psychology emphasize that infidelity is not typically the primary cause of a relationship's collapse, but rather a final outcome of a gradual erosion within the relationship's psychological structure. A woman does not suddenly shift from commitment to seeking an alternative. Instead, she undergoes a series of internal transformations that often begin with emotional dissatisfaction, followed by silent frustration, then gradual psychological withdrawal, until the idea of another man emerges as a perceived possibility or psychological escape. From this standpoint, infidelity-related behavior can be understood as a compensatory mechanism through which the female psyche attempts to fill a gap in fundamental needs that are no longer being met within the primary relationship, such as emotional security, appreciation, a sense of worth, or psychological containment. These needs are not luxuries within a woman's psychological makeup. They are core pillars necessary for the continuation of a healthy emotional bond. Research in dynamic and psychoanalytic psychology suggests that when a woman seeks another man, she is not necessarily seeking a new relationship for its own sake, but rather attempting to recover a lost psychological state, the feeling of being seen, heard, desired, and valued as an autonomous self, not merely as a functional role within the relationship. In many cases, the other man becomes a symbolic figure or psychological container onto which these unmet needs are projected, rather than being the ultimate goal in himself. Accordingly, understanding this phenomenon requires moving away from superficial moral interpretations and toward a deeper psychological analysis that views infidelity as a symptom of a pre-existing imbalance rather than a sudden deviation. In this sense, it is not merely a betrayal of the relationship, but often an unconscious expression of self-betrayal within a relationship that no longer provides psychological nourishment. Contrary to the dominant stereotypes perpetuated by popular culture and media, where women's emotional behavior is frequently reduced to sexual desire or momentary external temptation, contemporary research in emotional and social psychology reveals a far more complex reality. Women, in most cases, are not driven solely by pleasure, nor do they seek another man as a simple physical or emotional replacement for their partner. Instead, they are motivated by a deeper psychological need to restore meaning and coherence within their inner emotional world. In this context, the search for another man often becomes an unconscious attempt to reconstruct an internal emotional framework that has gradually deteriorated over time, such as a sense of self-worth, emotional safety, psychological containment, and the feeling of being desired, visible, and significant to another person. These elements are not secondary additions to a woman's emotional experience. They constitute the very core of her sense of belonging and relational stability. When this emotional meaning begins to fracture, due to persistent emotional coldness, chronic neglect, accumulated unresolved conflicts, or the loss of genuine intimate connection, the bond does not disappear abruptly. Instead, it enters a phase of silent erosion. At this stage, a woman may remain physically present in the relationship while gradually withdrawing psychologically as her internal sense of emptiness and emotional alienation expands. Here, the heart is not the sole driver. The mind also becomes actively engaged, initiating psychological search mechanisms for potential alternatives. This is not driven by superficial pleasure or transient desire, but rather as a response to restore lost psychological equilibrium. Numerous studies suggest that the female psyche naturally seeks internal coherence, and when this coherence is disrupted within the primary relationship, it begins to seek external sources capable of re-establishing a sense of harmony and emotional safety. Thus, turning toward another man is better understood not as an urge to escape the relationship, but as an expression of unmet internal needs and an attempt to revive a psychological state that once existed in the early stages of the bond and was gradually lost. In many cases, the other man is not the destination, but a mirror reflecting a version of the woman's self that she felt had faded or was no longer appreciated within her current relationship. From the perspective of attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, emotional relationships function as psychological systems that regulate security, closeness, and mutual reliance. A healthy relationship provides what is known as a secure base, a state in which the individual feels accepted, supported, and emotionally safe, enabling them to explore the world, build their identity, and cope with stress from a position of internal confidence. However, when the primary relationship fails to fulfill this role due to repeated rejection, emotional coldness, inconsistent responsiveness, or persistent signals of insignificance, the relationship itself transforms from a source of safety into a source of psychological anxiety. In such cases, attachment no longer regulates comfort, but instead triggers internal instability. Within this framework, turning toward a new partner is less an act of emotional betrayal and more a psychological attempt to reconstruct a lost secure base, even if this occurs with partial awareness or without full insight into the underlying motivations. In parallel, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs offers a complementary explanatory lens. After basic needs are met, human beings, particularly women within emotional contexts, seek to fulfill needs for belongingness and esteem. When a primary relationship fails to provide genuine emotional belonging or to reinforce a woman's sense of value and self-respect, this deficiency manifests as chronic internal tension. At this stage, seeking another partner becomes an indirect attempt to satisfy these higher psychological needs, not necessarily to break the relationship, but to preserve internal psychological balance. Recent research supports this theoretical understanding. A multinational study published in Evolution and Human Behavior in 2024 found that over 64% of women who engaged in extradyadic relationships attributed their behavior to overall dissatisfaction within their primary relationship, with a strong emphasis on emotional failure rather than sexual motivation. These findings highlight a fundamental difference in psychological drivers between women and men. Men, according to prevailing trends in evolutionary psychology, are more likely to engage in infidelity for sexual or opportunistic reasons, whereas women tend to be driven by persistent and profound emotional deprivation. Within this framework, the concept of emotional compensation emerges as a key explanatory construct. The new relationship is not experienced as an adventure, but is psychologically invested in as an alternative space where the female psyche finds containment, attention, and emotional recognition. The new emotional connection functions as a psychological anesthetic or affect regulation mechanism, alleviating feelings of loneliness, internal emptiness, or emotional marginalization that have accumulated within the original relationship. Thus, a woman's search for another partner cannot be understood apart from the psychological structure that has gradually collapsed within the primary relationship. It is not an isolated act, but a direct outcome of the relationship's failure to perform its deeper psychological functions, transforming the new partner into a last, conscious or unconscious attempt to reclaim safety, belonging, and lost meaning. This behavior cannot be easily reduced to an absence of love or emotional attachment to the primary partner. Clinical studies and psychological interviews reveal that many women who engage in extradyadic relationships simultaneously report genuine emotional bonds and sincere love for their spouses or partners. The apparent contradiction between love and infidelity is not a psychological inconsistency, but rather an expression of a complex internal conflict between emotional need and relational reality. In many cases, turning to another relationship does not signify a desire to end the primary bond, but rather a desperate attempt to preserve the psychological integrity of the self. A woman who feels invisible, unheard, or unvalued within her relationship may begin to experience a painful erosion of selfhood. As this feeling accumulates, an external relationship can become a defensive mechanism aimed at restoring a sense of existence, not at replacing the partner or committing betrayal in its moral sense. Many women describe this state with phrases such as, "I was disappearing, I no longer recognize myself," or "I was living as a role, not as a human being." In this context, the external relationship becomes a symbolic space reflecting the woman's lost image of herself, offering a temporary sense of desirability, influence, and emotional presence. These psychological dynamics cannot be separated from the broader social and cultural context. Accumulated daily pressures, modern life demands, and ongoing shifts in gender roles all contribute to psychological strain. This burden intensifies when women spend years in roles that require continuous self-sacrifice, such as marriage, motherhood, and invisible domestic labor, without sufficient emotional recognition or psychological appreciation. Over time, this can generate a deep sense of identity loss, as though the woman has dissolved into her responsibilities and no longer exists as an independent self beyond what she provides to others. Under such conditions, seeking another man is not an act of selfish impulsivity or emotional recklessness, but a psychological response aimed at rescuing the self from emotional exhaustion or internal emptiness. It is an indicator of emotional imbalance within the primary relationship rather than evidence of moral weakness or superficial desire for temptation or novelty. Ultimately, this behavior is best understood as a warning signal of a profound structural imbalance within the relationship, not as a definitive judgment of a woman's ethics or intentions. Recognizing these psychological dynamics opens the door to prevention and healing through enhancing emotional communication, rebuilding psychological closeness, and acknowledging unmet needs before they accumulate and evolve into silent crises or relational breakdowns that become increasingly difficult to contain. Understanding, in this context, is not about justification, it is about awareness. And awareness is the first step toward more mature, balanced, and genuinely human relationships.